Here's a chart of all games throughout the first 58 years of the Super Bowl era quarterbacked by players who threw at least 20 passes. They're plotted by season along the x-axis, and along the y-axis, what their actual passer rating would be sans baseless, irrational constraints employed by the NFL that warp the true number of thousands of performances and artificially keep the range between 0 and 158.3. But I think alternative perspectives could prove insightful as well. But instead of providing visual context as to where along the space-time continuum each of the games occurred, we'll replace the x-axis with pass attempts to provide visual context as to the level of volume the actual passer ratings represent. As you'd imagine, the lion's share of the most outrageous days at the office reside at or near our minimum threshold of 20 passes, since the smaller the sample, the more feasible it is to produce outliers. So this is a way to dole out flowers to those who are able to produce outliers stemming from samples a bit greater in size. We'll start with the good. There are two for whom I'd say the volume perspective is most beneficial. One is a 2013 Nick Foles game in which he maintained an actual passer rating north of 211 across 28 attempts. So if we use that number of passes as our minimum threshold instead of 20, you can see that at the time, no one who'd thrown at least that many attempts had generated an actual passer rating of even 180, and to this day, no one has had such a game come within even 20 points of 11-3, 13 Foles. The other is 10-26-14 Big Ben Roethlisberger, who was somehow able to maintain a completion percentage of 81.6 for 10.7 yards a pop and a touchdown percentage of 12.2 without tossing a pick across 49 passes. To this day, no one who's eclipsed even 42 attempts in a game has come all that close to the 155.3 mark Ben pulled off that afternoon. Among the more than 850 games in which a quarterback reached a pass total as high as 49, no one at the time had come within even 22 points of him, and in the time since, it's only been done once by 11-1-15 Drew Brees, who was still over 16 points south. I'd be remiss to not take a sec and point out that 1 week after Ben tossed 6 touchdowns, he did so again. To provide some context, let's use Phil Rivers, who retired with the 5th most passing touchdowns ever, and Matt Ryan, who retired with the 9th most passing touchdowns ever. Not only did neither of them ever have a single career game with as many as 6 passing scores, they combined for only 1 career game with even 5. So Ben reached a number in back-to-back games that neither the former Falcons stalwart nor the former Chargers stalwart ever did. For those scoring at home, that's 12 passing touchdowns across a 2-game stretch, while no one else in the Super Bowl era except 07 Brady has ever even had 11. Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre never passed for more than 9 touchdowns across back-to-back games, and neither Steve Young nor Dan Marino ever topped 8. That duo represents 2 of perhaps the 3 or 4 greatest quarterbacks the 20th century bestowed upon us, and Big Ben cleared that number by 50%. Is that relevant to this story? No, but I find it interesting. Okay, tangent over. We'll now descend to the bottom where 11-9-75 Kim McQuilkin was able to throw 26 passes while masterfully staying under -55. Also worthy of kudos is 10-12-69 Pete Beathard, who, despite cranking out 35 attempts, managed to sink over 20.5 points below zero, which, among those who have passed at least that much in a game, is nearly twice as large a sub-zero plunge as we've ever otherwise seen. Of course, there have also been jaw-dropping individual performances stemming from sub-20 pass games. For instance, we've marveled at games where QBs threw an abundance of picks in 20-ish passes. Well, guess what? The obviously funnier games of guys throwing a bunch of picks in fewer than 20 passes were omitted. And in those cases, the smaller sample enhances rather than diminishes the feat. So allow me to at least give a quick shout out to a trio of heroes who managed to toss 5 picks in no more than 15 passes. 9-16-73 Archie Manning, 10-23-77 Dan Pastorini, who's a legend around these parts, and last but not least, 11-19-17 Nate Peterman. And to neatly tie things up, let's take a glance at the more than 3,400 instances through the first 58 years of the Super Bowl era in which, thanks to the bullshit boundaries, there was a discrepancy between artificial and actual passer rating, to give an idea of just how prevalent these occurrences are. The same game that produced the top actual passer rating, 9819 Lamar Jackson, also produced the game in which the artificial constraints most shortchanged a quarterback. However, its counterpart, the game that received the largest bogus boost, isn't the 10-9-72 Pastorini game that brings up the actual passer rating rear. The boundaries were friendly enough to give Dan a 59-point boost up to 0, but even that performance doesn't owe as much credit to the constraints as does 10-27-68 Mike Tolliver. A mirror image of 9819 Lamar with roughly 65 points worth of artificial manipulation, Tolliver threw picks on a quarter of his passes that day, which fueled his actual passer rating of negative 46.7. But thanks to clearing the minimum thresholds for completion percentage and yards per attempt, his passer rating is presented to the public as positive 17.9. In what's a strong contender for the most miserable game by a quarterback, not only did Tolliver also lose multiple fumbles, but when he was benched, his backup came in and immediately lit it up. Tom Sherman's 8 passes yielded 146 yards and 2 scores, good for an actual passer rating of 203.1. So in the same game, playing with the same teammates and against the same opponent, one man produced the 8th worst game of the Super Bowl era, while the other, garbage time and smallish sample be damned, produced what would have been the 8th best if he'd had enough attempts to qualify. Within a cluster of nearly 25,000 entrants, the chasm between the two makes the Grand Canyon look puny. Generally speaking, if not for the bullshit artificial constraints, or for samples large enough where they're moot, I personally find passer rating to be one of many pretty reliable tools in the quarterback evaluation toolbox. To me, there appears to be a reasonably strong positive correlation between that number and a quarterback's level of passing proficiency across a given sample. One player who's always seemed like an awfully big exception to that is former Colts quarterback and flip phone enthusiast Andrew Luck, whose mediocre career passer rating belies one of the most talented quarterbacks I've ever seen, but I digress. I believe passer rating is crying out for at least 2 major upgrades that would give it a huge, much-needed facelift. One you should be able to guess if you've been paying any attention. Bury the bullshit artificial constraints at the bottom of the ocean. Stop the lies. It's madness. The bigger samples would by and large remain untouched, while it'd represent smaller samples like games, accurately. 2. Do the same to the completion percentage element of the equation. It's already inherently baked into the yards per attempt element. After all, yards per attempt is simply completion percentage multiplied by yards per completion. There is absolutely no reason to double down on it and, for instance, further reward a guy like 2016 Sam Bradford, who at the time broke the single-season record by completing 71.6% of his passes, but did so on the back of endless dump-offs and checkdowns. That led to a terrible yards per completion of 9.82, thus producing a subpar 7.02 yards per attempt. And I mean subpar literally. 7.02 was literally worse than the 2016 NFL average. Do you have any idea just how difficult it is to complete passes at a rate higher than anyone ever had to that point in history, yet still produce fewer yards per pass than the average quarterback that season? Well, it is really, really difficult. And it's not just confined to that campaign either. He remains in the southern yards per pass hemisphere even when looping in the average from every 300 pass season ever. Accounting for that 71.6% once within the broader yards per attempt formula is enough. There is zero need to isolate and provide exponentially more weight to it. Interestingly enough, this might be most clearly manifested within 2 nuclear performances against the 2013 Raiders. While Nick Foles and Alex Smith had identical touchdown and interception percentages, Smith's actual passer rating was nearly 5 points higher than Foles's thanks to a superior completion percentage. But Foles' lower completion percentage was more than cancelled out by averaging over 1.5 more yards per completion, thus still managing to pass for a bit more yardage per attempt. So I don't like that the formula has his game below Smith's. So there ought to be 3, not 4, core metrics around which the complex passer rating formula ought to revolve as an optimized analog: yards per attempt, touchdown percentage, and interception percentage. There is room to debate what the optimized mathematical relationship between the metrics should be and how they're applied within the broader formula, but one thing is unequivocally certain regarding the number attached to the most astounding performances: there should be no artificial floors and no artificial ceilings. Let them all flow freely and naturally, as nature intended. Thanks for watching Secret Base. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you want to get a peek at even more stuff and see your name included alongside all these other very smart and good-looking people, subscribe to Secret Base on Patreon.